My name is Hannah Carter. I am 30 years old and I'm from Phoenix, Arizona. For most of my life, my father had only two words to describe me: uneducated and worthless. He said it at family dinners, in front of relatives, even in front of strangers. But what he never knew was that every insult he threw at me was quietly building the moment that would change everything. Because the night he mocked me in front of everyone was the same night I finally told him who I really was. Have you ever had someone look you straight in the eyes and decide your entire worth in a single sentence? What if that person was your own father, the man who never missed a chance to call you uneducated, lazy, and a disappointment? Would you argue back, or would you stay quiet and let him believe the lie? And what happens when the person he mocked for years finally stands up in front of the entire room and calmly reveals the truth he never bothered to learn? Because sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one holding the biggest secret. Growing up in my father's house meant living with a label that never seemed to change. Uneducated, worthless, those were the words he used to describe me, not once, not occasionally. But so often that eventually it started to feel like those words were permanently attached to my name. The strange part is, it didn't start with screaming arguments or dramatic fights. It started quietly, almost casually, like a joke he thought everyone should laugh at. When I was 16, we were sitting at a family dinner. My cousins were talking about their grades and college plans. One of them had just gotten into a prestigious university, and the whole table burst into applause. Then someone looked at me and asked, "So Hannah, what about you? What are your plans?" Before I could even open my mouth, my father leaned back in his chair and laughed. "Oh, Hannah," he said loudly. "She's not exactly the academic type. Let's just say she's not the brightest." The table went silent for a moment. A few people chuckled awkwardly. Others looked down at their plates. And I sat there, forcing a smile, pretending it didn't sting. But that was just the beginning. Over the years, those comments became part of his personality. Every family gathering turned into another opportunity for him to remind everyone that I was the disappointment of the family. When my older brother landed a corporate internship, my dad proudly told everyone about it for weeks. "Now that's a smart kid," he'd say. Then he'd glance at me and add, almost as an afterthought, "Well, not all my kids can be winners." People laughed, and the worst part was that no one ever really challenged him. Maybe they thought he was joking, maybe they didn't want to get involved, or maybe they simply believed him. By the time I turned 22, his words had become almost predictable. If there was a family birthday party, he would eventually bring up my lack of direction. If relatives visited from out of town, he'd introduce me like this. "This is my daughter Hannah, the one who never quite figured life out." Every time he said it, people would glance at me with that same expression, half pity, half judgment. And I would just nod politely, staying quiet, because arguing with him never worked. I had tried that once. I remember standing in the kitchen after another embarrassing dinner, finally snapping and saying, "Why do you always say those things about me?" He didn't even hesitate. "Because they're true," he replied calmly. Then he shrugged and added, "If you don't like hearing it, maybe prove me wrong." That sentence stayed with me longer than he probably realized. Not because it hurt, but because it revealed something important. My father had already decided who I was. In his mind, I was the daughter who failed, the one who didn't measure up. The one people whispered about when comparing their successful children. And once someone decides who you are, they stop paying attention to everything else. They stop asking questions. They stop noticing details. They stop looking for the truth, which meant my father never noticed the late nights I spent working on things he didn't understand. He never asked why I disappeared for hours at a time. He never wondered why I suddenly seemed so calm whenever he mocked me, because in his mind, there was nothing to investigate. He thought he had already figured me out. To him, I was still the same uneducated, worthless daughter he had been describing for years. What he didn't realize was that while he was busy turning me into the family joke, I was quietly building a life he couldn't even imagine. And one day, sooner than he expected, he was going to learn just how wrong he had been. The truth about my life was something my father never bothered to look for. He was too busy building his own version of reality, one where I was the failed child who would never achieve anything meaningful. In his mind, he had already written my story. There was no need to read further chapters, no need to ask questions, no need to dig deeper. But the real story of my life was happening quietly, behind closed doors, in places he never thought to look. While he believed I was wasting my time, sleeping late, or wandering through life without purpose, I was living a completely different double existence. During the day, I played the role he expected me to play. I kept my head down. I answered questions politely. I accepted the insults with a calm face because I knew arguing would only give him more ammunition. But at night, everything changed. While my family thought I was just scrolling through social media or wasting time on entertainment, I was studying. Not just casually studying, but obsessively learning skills that I knew would give me independence. I started learning digital marketing, online business strategies, and financial management through free online platforms. I spent hours watching tutorials, reading case studies, and practicing skills on freelance websites using anonymous profiles. I didn't tell anyone about this, not even my closest friends, because I knew how quickly information traveled in my family. If my father found out I was doing something productive, he would have found a way to mock it. Online work isn't real work, he would have said, so I kept everything hidden. I saved every small amount of money I earned. When I made my first small freelance payment, I didn't celebrate loudly. I simply stared at my phone screen in silence, feeling something I hadn't felt in years, control over my own life. It wasn't much money, but it wasn't about the amount. It was about the realization that I could survive without depending on his approval. I also started building professional connections online. I joined virtual communities where people didn't know my family background. There, I was Hannah the disappointment. I was just another person trying to improve their life. For the first time, I felt what respect without judgment felt like. Meanwhile, at home, my father continued to believe I was doing nothing important. There were moments when I almost wanted to tell him the truth. Sometimes I imagined walking into the living room and showing him my work portfolio, my certifications, and the small client contracts I had already secured. But something always stopped me. Not fear. Not anger, but observation, because I realized something important about my father. He didn't actually want to understand me. He wanted confirmation that he was right about me. And people like that don't react to success with pride, they react with disbelief, or worse, with attempts to minimize it. So I kept working silently. I learned how to present myself professionally. I studied communication skills, business negotiation, and leadership psychology. I wanted to be ready for the moment when I would no longer need to defend myself with words. Instead, I would let results speak for me. The most painful part was watching how differently he treated my siblings. Every achievement they had was celebrated loudly. Pictures were posted on social media. Stories were repeated to relatives. Pride filled his voice when talking about them, but when it came to me, silence was his only acknowledgement. And I learned to live in that silence, because sometimes silence isn't weakness, sometimes silence is preparation. While he thought I was falling behind in life, I was actually building something he couldn't measure with traditional success standards. I was learning independence, emotional resilience, and financial literacy. Things he never considered important because he believed success only came from traditional academic prestige. But life was changing fast outside his limited perspective, and the more I grew quietly, the more I understood one powerful truth. You don't always have to win arguments with people who already decided they know who you are. Sometimes, you just have to become so successful that their definition of you becomes completely irrelevant. And I was slowly, patiently, and strategically doing exactly that, waiting for the day when the truth would no longer be something I had to hide. Because eventually, The truth was going to come out on its own. That dinner started like every other family gathering, loud, crowded, and filled with conversations I didn't really belong in. The dining table was packed with relatives, distant cousins, and family friends my father wanted to impress. The smell of traditional home-cooked food filled the air, plates clinking, people laughing, glasses being refilled. On the surface, it looked like a normal, happy family moment. But I had learned long ago that family gatherings were rarely about happiness. They were about performance, and my father was always the main performer. That night, I sat quietly beside my younger cousin, slowly eating my food, trying to stay invisible. That was usually my strategy: eat slowly, speak only when spoken to, and leave as soon as possible without attracting attention. For a while, it was working. People were talking about business, politics, and relatives who had moved abroad for better opportunities. I was listening more than speaking, studying body language, tone changes, and social dynamics. Over time, I had learned that you could predict who would attack you next just by watching how they looked at you. And then it happened. My father cleared his throat loudly. That sound alone was enough to make my stomach tighten, because I knew what was coming. He leaned forward, smiling in that way he always did when he was about to make one of his funny comments about me. "So," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "how is our famous daughter doing these days, still trying to figure out what she wants to do with her life?" A few people laughed, not loudly, just politely. The kind of laughter people use when they don't want to get involved but also don't want to disagree. He continued, "You know, I keep telling her education is important. If she had focused more on real studies instead of wasting time, she might actually be successful by now." The words were delivered casually, like he was giving life advice. But everyone at the table knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't giving advice. He was humiliating me publicly again. Normally, I would stay quiet. I had mastered the art of neutral facial expressions. I would nod slightly, finish my food, and wait for the night to end. But that night felt different. Maybe it was because I had been building something in secret for too long. Maybe it was because I was tired of shrinking myself to make him comfortable. Or maybe it was because I finally understood that silence had power, but so did truth. So instead of responding emotionally, I stayed calm. Too calm. I slowly placed my fork down on the plate. I took a small sip of water. Then I looked directly at him. That was unusual, because I rarely made direct eye contact during these situations. The table slowly started to notice. My father noticed too. His smile tightened slightly, like he was sensing something was different. He laughed again, nervously this time. "What?" he said. "You want to argue again?" But instead of arguing, I simply said, very calmly, "I don't need to argue, I just think you should know something." The room got quieter. Not completely silent, but close enough that even small movements felt louder. People started putting down their utensils. My father's expression changed from confident to slightly suspicious. And that was when I knew I had control of the moment, because confidence is quiet, and real confidence doesn't rush to explain itself. But before I could continue, I realized something important. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about years of humiliation, years of public jokes, years of being treated like I had no value. And that night, I decided I wasn't going to defend myself. I was going to reveal the truth when I was ready, so I simply smiled and said, "You'll find out soon." That answer frustrated him more than any argument ever could. Because people like my father hate uncertainty. They want immediate reactions, emotional responses, arguments they can win. But I gave him something worse. I gave him patience. And that night, I saw something I had never seen before in his eyes. Not anger, not laughter, but something very close to discomfort. And that was when I realized the balance of power in our relationship was starting to change, even if he didn't realize it yet. If there was one person in my family my father actually respected, it was my grandfather. My grandfather wasn't loud. He wasn't dramatic. But he had something my father never had, authority that came from wisdom, not fear. While my father believed power meant control, my grandfather believed power meant truth spoken at the right time. That night, after the dinner table tension started to rise, I thought the story would just end like every other family gathering, me leaving quietly, my father feeling victorious, and everyone pretending nothing happened. But I was wrong, because halfway through the night, my phone started vibrating in my purse. I didn't recognize the number. Normally, I would ignore unknown calls, but something inside me told me to answer. So I stood up, walked toward the hallway, and answered quietly. Hello, on the other side was my grandfather's voice. Calm, slow, controlled. He didn't start with small talk. He didn't ask about the weather or how I was feeling. Instead, he said one simple sentence. I heard what happened at dinner. My heart started beating faster, because I knew what that meant. Somehow, information had already traveled through family gossip channels faster than I expected. But before I could respond, he continued. I want you to put me on speaker when you go back to the dining room. That was unusual. My grandfather didn't like confrontation, but when he decided to speak, people listened. So I walked back slowly, feeling everyone's eyes follow me as I sat down again. My father looked annoyed. Who was that? He asked. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I took a deep breath and said, It was Grandpa. The room changed immediately. My father straightened his posture. His confident expression shifted slightly, not fear but caution. Because even he knew that my grandfather was not someone to be casually dismissed. Then I turned on speakerphone, and my grandfather spoke again. This time, his voice was louder so everyone could hear. Son, he said calmly to my father. I think it's time you stop embarrassing your daughter in front of people. The table went completely silent, not awkward silence. The kind of silence that happens when someone powerful enters the conversation unexpectedly. My father tried to laugh it off. Dad, I was just joking, but my grandfather cut him off immediately. No, you were not joking. You have been humiliating that girl for years. My father's smile disappeared. My grandfather continued. You think success only comes from academic titles. You think because she chose a different path, she is worthless, but you never once asked what she was doing behind the scenes. My father tried to speak again, but my grandfather didn't allow it. You don't know how hard she has been working. You don't know what she is building. And you never bothered to ask because it was easier to criticize than to understand. At that moment, my hands started shaking slightly, not from fear, but from emotional release. Because someone was finally saying what I had been feeling for years, my grandfather's voice softened slightly. She is not your disappointment. She is just someone who chose a different path from the one you wanted. Then, he delivered the final blow. If you keep treating your child like a failure, don't be surprised when one day she stops considering you family. The room was completely frozen. Even relatives who usually supported my father were silent. My father didn't respond immediately. For the first time in years, he had nothing to say. That was when I realized something powerful. Respect doesn't always come from loud arguments. Sometimes it comes from someone else speaking truth on your behalf when you have been silenced for too long. My grandfather ended the call with one final statement. Be careful how you treat people on their way up, because one day they won't need you to validate their success. And then he hung up. The room remained silent for several long seconds. My father didn't look at me. He just stared at the table in front of him like he was processing something he couldn't control. And for the first time in my life, I saw uncertainty in his eyes. Not anger, not pride, just realization that the narrative he had built about me for years was starting to crack open. The night didn't end with loud arguments. It didn't end with dramatic confrontations. In fact, the most powerful moment was something much quieter, much colder, and far more permanent. Because by the end of that night, I realized something that changed the entire dynamic between my father and me. Control wasn't taken with anger. Control was taken with calm success. After my grandfather's phone call, the atmosphere in the house felt different. It wasn't openly hostile. Nobody was shouting, nobody was fighting, but there was tension in the silence. My father barely spoke for the rest of the evening. That alone was unusual. Normally, he loved being the center of conversation. He enjoyed giving opinions, telling stories, and making comments about everyone's life choices. But that night, he stayed unusually quiet, and I knew why, because he was thinking. Not about me as his daughter, but about the possibility that he had been wrong, and that is something prideful people struggle to accept. Later that night, when most guests had left, I was in the kitchen helping clean up. I didn't do it because I wanted to please him. I did it because I wanted to observe. Sometimes the best strategy in emotional warfare is not to attack, but to watch how your opponent behaves when they realize they might be losing. My father walked into the kitchen after a few minutes. He didn't start with insults. He didn't start with criticism. Instead, he stood beside me silently, watching me wash dishes. That was new. Finally, he spoke. "You've changed," he said. Not as an insult, more like a statement he was trying to understand. I didn't respond immediately. I just kept washing the dishes slowly. After a long pause, he continued. "I didn't know you were doing all those things behind my back." That was when I realized something important. He didn't feel anger. He felt surprise. And sometimes, surprise is more dangerous to ego than anger. I turned off the water and wiped my hands slowly before turning to face him. "I wasn't doing things behind your back," I said calmly. "I was doing things for myself." That sentence hit harder than any argument could have, because for years, he had believed that my only purpose was to either prove him right or wrong. He had never considered the possibility that I could build a life independent of his opinions. He stood there quietly for a moment. Then he said something I never expected. "Are you successful now?" It wasn't said aggressively. It was said almost cautiously, like he was afraid of the answer. I didn't brag. I didn't give him numbers or details. Instead, I simply said, "I am becoming successful in ways that matter to me." And that was enough, because success isn't always about financial status or social recognition. Sometimes success is about emotional independence, the ability to wake up every day without needing someone else's approval to feel valuable. From that moment forward, something shifted permanently. He didn't stop talking to me, but he stopped making public jokes about me. He didn't suddenly become emotionally supportive, but he started speaking to me with more caution. And that was how I knew control had changed, not through revenge, not through confrontation, but through quiet transformation. The real revenge wasn't humiliating him in front of others. It wasn't arguing or fighting. The real revenge was becoming someone he could no longer define. Because for years, he had built a version of me in his mind, the failure, the disappointment, the uneducated child. But reality doesn't care about old narratives. Reality only cares about results. And by the end of that night, I realized something powerful. People don't change because you fight them. They change because you outgrow the version of yourself they were comfortable controlling. And that was when I knew the old version of my relationship with my father was officially over, not with anger, but with final, quiet closure. If this story hit you emotionally, don't just scroll away. Think about this for a second. Have you ever been labeled by someone who was supposed to believe in you? Have you ever been called weak, uneducated, or worthless by the people who should have protected you the most? If yes, then you already know how powerful it feels when you finally take control of your own story. Drop a comment below and tell me, have you ever faced family humiliation but turned your life around silently? Speech Balloon, share this video with someone who needs to hear this message today. Because sometimes, the quietest victories are the most powerful ones. And if you're new here, like this video and subscribe, because more emotional, revenge, and real-life survival stories are coming soon. Fire.